Hey everybody, this is just a video to give you all a quick overview of what you'll be covering in your textbook reading for the week. Okay, so your first new reading this week, like you have some review reading, your first new reading this week comes from chapter 17, Business and Labor in the Industrial Era, on pages 794 to 829. And we're going to look at the causes of industrial growth. So during the late 19th century, there was a sharp increase in agricultural and industrial production. So the National Railroad Network, that transcontinental railroad system that we looked at last week, remember? It grew to nearly 200,000 miles, which made it the most extensive in the world. The massive increase in industrialization expanded the use of electrical power. Thank you, Thomas Edison. And also, importantly, the application of scientific research to industrial processes. And this is because the incentive was there to find the best, most efficient process possible to increase profits. The Bessemer converter is an example of this, and it allowed for the mass production of steel. A lot of businesses at this time grew to enormous size and power, and they often ignored ethics as well as the law in the process. You had entrepreneurs like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J. Pierpont Morgan, who were extraordinarily skilled and successful at gaining control of particular industries. Companies such as Standard Oil, which was John D. Rockefeller's company, and Carnegie Steel practiced both vertical integration, which means that they controlled all of the various enterprises needed to produce and distribute their products. So they didn't need to pay anybody for the steps along the way that it took to make their product, and they didn't need to pay anyone to distribute their products because they owned all of those intermediary companies and enterprises. So they also practiced horizontal integration, and that means that they either absorbed or eliminated their competitors, right? So they got rid of the competition. Now, there were laws in place to prevent monopolies, right? So those laws were already there. So to sidestep those laws, they created trusts and eventually holding companies. And J. Pierpont Morgan and Company was an investment bank owned by J. Pierpont Morgan that pioneered methods for doing just that, right? He pioneered methods for sidestepping those monopoly laws, so for consolidating corporations and eliminating competition. The federal government allied with big business in different ways. Remember, they encouraged economic growth after the Civil War by imposing high tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. They granted public lands to railroad companies and settlers in the West, as we looked at last week and you read about last week, by establishing a stable currency. So they established a currency like for the entire country rather than states having their own currencies. And they encouraged the creation of land-grant universities to accelerate technical innovation and research. Remember those universities that would teach mining and farming and those industries that were growing during this time. These universities were teaching people to do that rather than focusing on more academic types of things. So those are the A&M universities, remember, agricultural and mechanics. Okay, equally important, the local, state, and federal governments did very little to regulate the activities of business. And this is known as a laissez-faire policy. Laissez-faire means let it be in French, and this indicates a policy in which the government maintains a hands-off approach to business, right? They just let them do their thing without really regulating how they do it. So this had pros and cons. On the positive side, it allowed entrepreneurs to experiment with ways to organize and grow and increase their profits. So it allowed the companies to grow more quickly. They didn't have limitations in place to slow them down anywhere. On the negative side, it did nothing to prevent certain types of corruption and abuse, and there was quite a bit of that. All of this was bringing about a changed social order. So you had the business owners and the financial elite, those who created the jobs, were living in extravagant homes. They had lavish parties. The urban and industrial workforce was largely composed of unskilled workers, and child labor, which had been practiced throughout much of history in most places, it hadn't yet been made illegal in the United States, and it sometimes involved children as young as 8 years old working 12-hour days in sometimes very unsafe conditions, because there was also often little concern for workplace safety. And so work-related accidents and diseases were not uncommon. Industrialization and the rise of big business also led to a growing middle class and growing numbers of women who went to college, took business and professional jobs, and participated in other public activities. So you have some positives going on in there, and you also have some negatives going on. And then there were the beginnings of the unions, right? And it was difficult for unskilled workers to organize effectively into unions for several reasons. Okay, there were sometimes racial and ethnic tensions among the laborers. There were also language barriers. Owners and supervisors would make efforts to keep workers from unionizing, right? Because it wasn't necessarily in their best interest to have to pay people more or to provide safe working conditions, right? Because that costs money. So business owners often hired people known as strike breakers. So you would have the union workers, the laborers would go on strike, and then they would be demanding, better conditions, more money, and the owners would hire people known as strike breakers. And these were usually immigrant workers who were very poor, they were desperate, and they were willing to take jobs for whatever wage was offered. And so that kind of break the strike. In spite of this, though, unions did form, and some of them went on to a national level to advocate for workers' rights. But there was a shadow cast over the idea of unions by violence and riots that were associated with them sometimes. So there were several strikes and riots that stood out. There was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Riot 1886, the Homestead Steel Strike in 1892, and the Pullman Strike in 1894. And these kinds of things caused many Americans to view unions as dangerous and politically radical. Okay, so that is a summary of your first new reading section for the week. So your second reading section is a bit shorter, and this is from chapter 19, pages 913 through 927, Political Stalemate and Rural Revolt. And the part you'll be focusing on, the heading you'll find in your textbook for this, is Farmers and the Money Problem, starting on page 913. Okay, so this is just a really brief, there's a lot of detail in your reading section on this. So this is just kind of a brief overview of the issues that it's talking about. But there's a lot of detail in there. It's very interesting. So over the course of the late 19th century, the money problem had become a central political issue. And this was the fact that the supply of money had not increased as the economy had grown. As a matter of fact, from the end of the Civil War, 1865 to 1890, the amount of money in circulation in both paper and coins had decreased by about 10%. And this raised the cost of borrowing money as interest rates were increased. And many farmers believed that coining silver rather than having a gold standard system would lead to inflation, which in turn would increase the value of their crops and reduce their debts. It would decrease the value of the money, but more money would be in circulation. And so this is where the inflation would come in, right? Because inflation is when the price of things go up and there's more money in circulation, but that money is worth less. Other people believed that maintaining the gold standard, which was called a sound money policy, would keep the money supply more stable. So the money in circulation would be worth more, it would be backed by gold. So some of those who would benefit from maintaining the gold standard would be those who loaned money, right? So the creditors would benefit from this. The limited currency would increase their profits. But the main difference between those two is that one of them decreases the value of money, but it puts a lot more money in circulation. And the other keeps the money at a certain stable value, but there's a lot less money in circulation. So farmers and others who were dissatisfied with the Republican and Democratic parties formed a series of political parties and alliances, one of which, known as the People's Party or the Populists, briefly operated as a national third party in the 1892 election. So the populist platform called for the unlimited coinage of silver. They called for a progressive income tax whose rate would rise with income levels. So in other words, the more money you made, the more income tax you paid. They called for the federal ownership of the railroads and the telegraph systems. So they said the federal government should own these businesses rather than private companies. And they also called for an 8-hour workday, instead of the 14-hour workdays. They called for an 8-hour workday and for laws that would restrict undesirable immigration. So they believed that what they referred to as the pauper, just like the very poor, the pauper and criminal classes of the world were immigrating into America and taking Americans' jobs. And so they advocated for limiting immigration. They also called for the expansion of government power to attack oppression, injustice, and poverty. So they were calling on the government to come in. Instead of having a laissez-faire approach, they were calling on the government to come in. And then there was the Panic of 1893, and this created a devastating depression. So just 10 days before Grover Cleveland was inaugurated in 1893, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy, and this set off a national financial crisis. This grew into the worst depression the United States had ever experienced up to this point. Other overextended railroad companies also collapsed and took a lot of banks down with them. European investors withdrew their funds from America, and a quarter of unskilled urban workers lost their jobs. Many others had their wages cut, and by the fall of 1893, more than 600 banks had closed and 15,000 businesses had failed. Farm foreclosures soared in the South, so farms were being foreclosed on in the South and in the West, and by 1900, a third of all farmers were renting their land rather than owning it as they had done before. And by 1894, the nation's economy had reached the bottom. But the depression lasted for another 4 years, with unemployment staying at around 20%, except in New York City, where the unemployment rate was close to 35%. And then in the election of 1896, the Democratic Party was struggling internally, but they nominated William Jennings Bryan, who adopted as his platform this coinage of silver, right? The moving over to coining silver rather than gold. The election of 1896 was one of the most dramatic in history, in part because there was a striking contrast between the candidates, but it was also because the terrible economic depression was making the stakes for this election very, very high. So the money problem was sort of the central focus of this election. And one observer said that the campaign took the form of a religious frenzy. And this was partly because Bryan, who was an evangelist, campaigned like one. He campaigned like an evangelist. So he was championing the poor, the discontented, the oppressed, and he was supported by struggling farmers, miners, and union members. And he was the first leader of a major party to call for the expansion of the federal government to help the working class. His opponent was William McKinley, who was a Republican, and he supported the gold standard, which means, again, to continue to back the nation's currency with gold. McKinley won the election in part by appealing to city dwellers and the industrial workers. And these workers in the cities found it easier to identify with McKinley's focus on reviving the industrial economy than with Bryan's free silver kind of evangelizing sort of message. Of the nation's 20 largest cities, Bryan only won New Orleans in the election. He won most of the West and all of the South, but he didn't get much support in the North and East, and he didn't win any states in the Midwest. And in the end, Bryan ended up winning the most votes of any candidate in history up to that point. So he got 6.5 million votes, but McKinley got even more votes. He got 7.1 million, and he won the Electoral College vote by 271 to 176. So even though Bryan had a lot of support, it was still a fairly decisive victory for McKinley there. Okay, so we'll stop there. I hope you're having a great week. Let me know when you have questions and how I can help you.